Welcome, everybody. A particularly warm welcome to all of our guests in the room and those of you who are joining us from the comfort of your drawing rooms. I particularly want to welcome our chairperson of St. James's Hospital Board, Catherine Malarkey, who will speak to you later, and Mary Day, CEO of St. James's Hospital, and the Provost of Trinity College, Linda Doyle. We have a number of panel members also here, equally esteemed, and I will introduce them all later. This is the first time that our Thriving Creative Life pillar in MISA has co-hosted the public annual lecture in combination or in collaboration with the Arts and Health Initiative, and in particular with Creative Ireland. And that's very fitting. It's fitting because we are holding this in the Davis Coakley Lecture Theatre. Fitting because our dear friend and colleague, Davis Coakley, was the founding director of MISA and the leading Irish champion for creativity and health. Today celebrates in a dramatic way his lasting legacy. Now, I have a confession to make. Initially, when Davis was making the case for the Creative Life pillar in MISA, I did not understand how this could possibly be operationalized. I just didn't get it. And there will be some of you in the audience and online who don't get it, who don't get or yet appreciate the subjective and objective health and well-being merits of creativity and of flourishing, which Daisy will cover later, for patients and of course for staff. I too was that person. But thanks to Davis, thanks to his persistence, thanks to his unbelievable vision, 2 decades ago, I was a convert and have been a convert ever since. And it's terrific to see this collaboration here tonight between his vision for the Creative Life pillar in MISA and our friends and colleagues in Creative Ireland and those of you in the creative community. I think part of the reason for my atheism, agnosticism, was the fact that we've been trained, many of us, in the biomedical model, trained to identify problems, to diagnose the cause of the problem, and to treat the diagnosis. Done and dusted. Creativity is still viewed by many as a soft science, but Daisy will shortly take care of that myth. And by and large, that myth is because of the narrow focus of those of us who are clinicians in the room, of our clinical training. I was so fortunate that Davis educated me and grounded the education in sound scientific evidence, which has been growing, escalating ever since. Today's speaker will open our minds to this fertile space and to the opportunity it holds for research and for healthcare delivery, which benefits patients, carers, and our staff, and our society. The Irish are noted globally for being a creative nation, a creative peoples. So let's show them what we can do with creativity and health. And without further ado, I'm going to ask our chairman, Catherine Malarkey, to come to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Roseanne. I'm delighted to get the opportunity to welcome you all here this evening to our annual MISA public lecture, which, as Roseanne pointed out, we're hosting in collaboration with Creative Ireland on the impact of the arts on public health. I think this topic is one that is central to the work that Roseanne and her team do here in MISA through the Creative Life Hub, which is run by Roisin Nevin. And the programs run by the Creative Life Hub, I think, really highlight the benefits of creativity in healthy aging and in promoting well-being, both physical and mental. I just want to, I suppose, take a minute to recognise Creative Ireland and what they do. I mean, they've been a long-term promoter of the arts throughout society, using the arts to connect people, to promote that creativity and well-being. And one of their programs, the Creative Ireland programme, which is a national initiative which runs until 2027, has been embraced by all 31 local authorities here in Ireland. And the aim of this programme is to promote participation in cultural and creative activities, thereby improving the well-being of individuals, communities, and the nation at large. And they are really fantastic projects that they run. There's a whole, it's across a whole range of things, from the young, they've targeted programs of the young and the old and everybody in between. So I think as we age, maintaining mental, emotional, and social health becomes increasingly important. And the arts, I think, offers a unique way and platform to support this. From painting, to music, dance, and theatre, creative engagement can help improve our cognitive function, reduce feelings of isolation, and simply provide a sense of purpose for many people. And for older adults, participating in and simply appreciating the arts can stimulate, sorry, I'm repeating myself there, am I? Apologies. So I suppose arts, I believe, has a profound role to play in the area of social prescribing. And I look forward to hearing more from our expert panel here tonight on how this might be expanded and more widely adopted within healthcare generally. And I think, the world today has become a very fast pace, and we really very often focus on the physical and productivity, and we do forget to make time for the arts in all our lives. And I think this is truly to our detriment. I think we need to recognise that engaging with the arts allow us to express emotions, connect with others, and find meaning and beauty in everyday life. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to the lady who knows most about it. So Roseanne, I think you're going to do the next bit. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Catherine. So I'm happy to introduce you to Daisy Fancourt, Professor of Psychobiology and Epidemiology at UCL and head of the Social Biobehavioral Research Group there. Her research focuses mostly on the effects of social connections and behaviors on health, including the social benefits, for example, loneliness, social isolation, arts and cultural engagement, and social prescribing. Daisy has received over 30 million in research funding, and her work has been recognized by over 24 national and international awards. She is also, latterly, director of the WHO Collaborating Centre on Arts and Health and a technical advisor to the WHO. And as you know, Trinity has been awarded a WHO Collaborating Centre award for longitudinal studies in aging and the life course, and we're enthusiastic about working with Daisy in introducing components of creativity into our longitudinal studies and those of others globally. Daisy is also a technical advisor and expert scientific advisor to UK government, a BBC New Generation thinker. I'll say that again, a BBC New Generation thinker, must suggest that to RTE, and a World Economic Forum global shaper. She's listed by Claire Evate as one of the most highly cited scientists in the world. So without further ado, thank you, Daisy, for coming to Ireland. We look forward to hearing you.
Thank you so much for that lovely welcome, and it is such a pleasure to be presenting to you today. As you heard, I head the Social Biobehavioral Research Group at UCL, and we're really interested in the role that both social deficits in our lives, like loneliness and isolation, as well as social assets, can play in supporting our health. So all of our research is essentially about asking, what is the effect of these social connections on our health outcomes? What are the mechanisms that underlie this, and who benefits most? And also, how can we actually think about modifying behaviors to support people in their health and well-being? And we have a diverse range of studies ongoing, including clinical trials, epidemiological work using cohorts and administrative data from around the world, as well as psychobiological experimental studies as well. But today I'm going to really focus exclusively on the work that we've been doing around arts and health. And arts are actually incredibly diverse behaviors that include all kinds of things that people do as part of their daily living. We actually propose that we can think about the arts in our lives as consisting of various active ingredients. So some of these ingredients are quite generic, like the arts can act as a vehicle to us experiencing physical activity, social interaction, cognitive stimulation, things that we already know affect diverse mental and physical health outcomes. But there are also some other ingredients in the arts that are more specific or particularly strongly expressed. So things like aesthetic engagement, multisensory stimulation, creativity and imagination. And these can activate additional health promoting pathways, things like meaning making, emotional expression, mastery, self-identity that support health outcomes. We've tried to see part of our role over the last decade or so in this space as providing more scientific frameworks that we can use to articulate these different processes and allow us to research them rigorously. So for example, in thinking about the ingredients within arts activities, we published a few years ago a framework on this called Innate. Now, we're not trying to categorize every single ingredient in the arts, because that would be a philosophically meaningless task. But what we are trying to say is, what are the most important ingredients within arts activities that could actually lead to health benefits? And this actually includes not just components of the projects or activities that people are doing, but also thinking about the social environments and the social groups they come into contact with, and aspects as well about the context underpinning this. And this is actually a really helpful way to think about the arts, because it gives us a language with which to articulate why we think they might be beneficial. But it also allows us to start comparing the arts to, for example, other health behaviors. You can see in the top right, I've produced one of our sample diagrams, which allows us to compare between active and control interventions within clinical trials to suggest what it is about the arts that could be affecting outcomes. And we've also used this in things like demonstrating that in multi-site clinical trials, the same intervention is definitely being produced in the contexts, and even showing how arts interventions might adapt as they settle into new clinical settings. We've also then tried to think more about the mechanisms that follow on from these ingredients. And we published a paper in Lancet Psychiatry a few years ago, where we reviewed all of the different mechanisms that have been identified in previous research studies. And we actually identified over 600 that have been looked at through previous research. But we categorize these broadly into psychological, biological, social, and behavioral processes. And particularly in this paper, we took the lens of complexity science, so arguing that the arts are complex interventions. And this means that many of these mechanisms do interact with one another and even work with sort of feedback loops. And this has really profound implications for how we're designing clinical trials and how we're measuring some of these effects. And we also identified that there are multi-level factors that moderate these relationships. So, different interventions can affect different individuals in different ways. And the context in which they're delivered can also play a moderating role. So again, being able to articulate and measure these is really important in conducting robust studies. And then in thinking about the outcomes of this, we've started collaborating with WHO about 7-8 years ago. And they commissioned us to do an evidence report on the field of arts and health. And we identified over 3,500 studies that had been conducted in this space, everything from laboratory-based experiments to qualitative and ethnographic research, clinical trials and epidemiological work as well. And one of the really big things in this report was demonstrating that the arts not only have a role potentially in supporting people when they have health conditions in the management or treatment of those, but also playing a role earlier on in the prevention of illness and broader health promotion. So naturally, I can't talk about all of the things that are in this report in the 40 minutes I've got. So I'm just going to pick up on some of the highlights from this and think at the end about some of the implications from this from a policy perspective. But just to say as well, I'm happy for slides to be shared afterwards. So I've put references to follow up on some of those papers as well. And I thought I'd break this down into thinking about the mind, brain, body, and behavior. So if we start off with the mind, I think the idea the arts support mental health is one of the things that people most instinctively know about. And actually, there have now been hundreds of studies that have demonstrated this, and meta-analyses of these studies actually demonstrate a pretty robust effect, even when you moderate a lot of the different core ingredients. So for example, thinking about music interventions, there's a large literature suggesting that actively engaging the music leads to reductions in depressive symptoms, as well as listening to recorded music on a regular basis. And this is shown across diverse types of arts engagement. So I wanted to give you a flavor of some of the kinds of trials that have been done in this space, and we've done quite a lot of work on this. So for example, in the top left, we conducted a number of trials now looking at women who have postnatal depression, identifying women who either have a diagnosis or are above threshold on symptoms. And we've run several clinical trials, randomizing them either into usual care, this was in the UK, so on the NHS, or 10-week singing programs with other mothers with postnatal depression, or comparison social groups within the same kind of community settings. And as you can see, we're actually finding recovery around a month earlier for mothers who engage in the singing interventions. And this has been robust across the clinical trials that we've run in this space. And this has actually now led to this intervention being commissioned in a number of parts of England, as well as being rolled out through WHO to several other countries internationally. We've also run a number of studies looking at interventions like group drumming within the community, focusing on people who have mild to moderate depression. And this is a population for which antidepressants aren't always effective or appropriate, but instead thinking about how we might be able to use the ingredients in arts activities that actually often mirror some of the ingredients in psychological therapies as well to support people. One of the interesting things we found through these trials was not only that the experimental groups had improvements in symptoms over 10-week interventions, but actually these results were maintained even several months after the end of the intervention. And this is really promising when thinking that even relatively short-term interventions could actually potentially have long-lasting effects. These have all been taking approaches where we've been designing bespoke activities to try and match the clinical group we've been working with. But we've also been increasingly working in the space of social prescribing or arts on prescription, whereby the mechanism of care is you can refer people to a broader choice of activities, which actually allows a greater tailoring of the ingredients to the individual's personal needs and context. We've actually been working with the health service in Greece on a large-scale trial recently involving 400 patients who were already going through psychiatric treatment with mental health services. And as you can see from this graph, we've actually seen that there are marked decreases in experiences of depression and anxiety amongst these clinical groups compared to a randomized waitlist control. So this is, again, interesting when we're thinking about those ingredients and considering that actually diverse types of arts activities can actually lead to similar improvements in mental health outcomes with quite meaningful effect sizes as well. For severe mental illness, the literature is actually a lot younger. We just don't have the same volume of literature so far, but also the space has scared a lot of people off. And part of the reason for this is a trial that was run just over a decade ago called the Matisse study. And this was an art therapy trial that involved a year of art therapy classes with patients with schizophrenia. And this famously not only found null effects, but actually potentially found some evidence of harm. But if you actually delve into the trial, the ingredients were completely off here. This was supposed to be 52 sessions of arts therapy, whereas a third of the intervention group never attended a single session, and the median number of attendances was 20%. Whereas the comparison, the control group, was more of a social-based activity that had really high attendance and very enthusiastic responses from participants. So there was a major design flaw in something to do with the acceptability and suitability and feasibility of that art therapy intervention. Actually, the meta-analyses of other trials, like, for example, music therapy studies, have shown much better results, including improvements in so-called positive symptoms like hallucinations and delusions, as well as in so-called negative symptoms like social and emotional withdrawal and broader aspects of psychopathology. So this makes us think about why we might be seeing this. Mechanistically, what is it about the arts that can lead to these outcomes? From a psychological perspective, we've done quite a bit of work thinking about things like emotion regulation, showing that arts engagement actually helps people to avoid stresses in their lives, but also helps them to approach some of these issues, using the arts as an opportunity to work through things, discharge negative emotions, for example, and also building up a sense of self so people feel more capable of tackling life challenges. We've also found in the top left, actually, that people with depression are able to use these strategies when engaging in the arts just as effectively as people without depression, which is actually contrary to some of the findings on other activities that people with depression, the ways that they regulate their emotions. So the arts may be particularly effective. From a neurobiological perspective, there's also a really interesting literature looking at neurotransmitters like dopamine, which are involved in pleasure response and broader activation of mesolimbic dopaminergic reward systems in the brain. So one of the things I find quite interesting here is the studies that have looked at dopamine release in response to arts interventions show that we not only get dopamine release in the pleasurable moments themselves of the arts, but actually in the anticipation of those pleasurable moments. So kind of double hit of dopamine. And we've also done quite a lot of psychobiological work in this space, experimentally showing that engagement in the arts leads to reductions in glucocorticoids like cortisol, a prominent stress hormone. And also showing that this coincides with an activation of immune response, particularly cytokine activity within the immune system. Now, cytokines are chemical messengers that essentially have inflammatory or anti-inflammatory states. And pro-inflammatory profiles are actually associated with poorer mood and with depressive symptoms. So they underlie a lot of mental health problems. And we've demonstrated that actually the ratio of pro to anti-inflammatory cytokine markers shifts from a more pro-inflammatory profile to a more anti-inflammatory profile, both across individual sessions of activities and also over multiple weeks of engagement. So this is providing a stronger biological underpinning to how we think about the arts and mental health. And alongside this is also broader well-being literature looking at how the arts support people's sense of mastery, of competence, of sense of self as well. And all of this has actually got us thinking about 8 years ago, whether there might also, in addition to the sort of management and treatment aspect, be a role for the arts in the prevention of mental illness in the first place. So we actually identified that there were dozens of questions on arts engagement that have been slipped into cohort studies over the decades, but never really been analysed. And we've done a lot of work, actually over 100 papers in the last 8 years, looking at the literature from these studies, showing that people's arts engagement over time is linked in with lower levels of mental distress, higher levels of mental functioning, higher levels of diverse aspects of well-being. Now, naturally, these are working with observational data, so we have to be really careful here on issues around confounding. But we've done extensive work mapping the kinds of factors that can be confounders in this relationship and applying sophisticated statistical approaches to account for these, as well as also applying approaches that account for unmeasured confounding and apply sort of causal inference methods to thinking about confounders. This has also allowed us to look at incidence of mental illness. And now repeatedly across lots of studies, we've demonstrated that higher levels of arts engagement is associated with a lower incidence of depression over the following decade or so. This is an example we did with ELSA, the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, looking at 2,500 older adults who'd never had depression and tracking them over the following decade, identifying a 48% lower odds of depression incidence once accounting for confounding factors. And recently, we've started taking this to an international level by identifying more aging cohorts that we can look at around the world. In this study, which we published last year in Nature Medicine, we looked at 16 different countries, and we looked at the relationship between creative hobby engagement and diverse aspects of health like depression, happiness, life satisfaction, and self-reported health. And then we meta-analysed all of our own findings for each of those countries and demonstrated overall meta-analytic effects for all of those factors and used a diverse range of statistical approaches to try and look at the causal inference from that. So overall, this is suggesting quite a lot of promise of thinking about this area as an adjunct way of supporting people with mental illness, but also as a way of supporting broader well-being. But from thinking about the mind, I now want to take us thinking a little bit more about the role that the arts can play in supporting cognition and also thinking about kind of neurodevelopmental disorders and disease as well. The arts is actually a really effective whole brain workout, so to speak, because of those diverse ingredients. There's actually multiple different aspects of the brain that are activated through arts engagement. And we see this actually right from in utero across people's whole lives. There's very interesting literature now showing that repeated arts engagement actually leads to functional and structural changes in the developing brain, including increased grey matter volume in certain brain regions and also increased white matter integrity and connections between certain brain regions. Now, naturally, some people have taken this to extremes and claimed that therefore, if children engage in the arts, they're going to become extraordinarily clever. But unfortunately, these kind of far transfer effects for like arts engagement improving your maths GCSE score are not particularly realistic. But there is nonetheless actually quite a lot of research on the near transfer effects showing that, for example, children's language development and reading development is stronger if they engage more in the arts. And that's both from observational and experimental studies. So in fact, by the point young children transition into secondary school, about 40% of the variance in their reading ability is explained by musical aptitude. And we also see that there are certain neurological processes that are stronger in people who have that musical training, including things like memory processes. So this has actually led to us thinking a lot more about the role the arts might play in supporting cognitive preservation as people age. And we have seen over the last couple of decades a really large literature emerging on the role that cognitive leisure could play in supporting cognitive reserves, so the preservation of cognition as we age, even in the presence of potentially pathological changes due to dementias. Now, the arts have often been included in these indices of cognitive leisure activities, and the findings now from tens of thousands of patients included in these observational studies, the meta-analytic findings have suggested that there are effects from this. But we actually wanted to delve deeper and see whether the arts were sort of passive parts of these indices or whether they were playing an active role. And again, using cohort data, we've identified that arts engagement is associated over the following decade with better preservation of memory in older adults and certain aspects of executive function as well. And we've also made use of really rich cognitive data in some of the aging cohorts, which includes not only physician diagnoses of dementia, but also rich cognitive batteries that allow us to ascertain whether individuals might be above the threshold for dementia, which suggested, again, there could be a potential preventative association here between engagement in the arts and dementia. And the effect sizes from this are actually similar for cultural engagement compared to social engagement, which is a much better established and accepted risk-reducing factor for dementia. Now, obviously, the massive caveat here is prodromal effects. So we know that some of the pathological changes that underlie dementia start 2 or 3 decades or even longer before symptoms emerge. So this is something that is a challenge within analyses. And to be honest, we're kind of waiting and biding our time to have longer cohort follow-up to really be able to ascertain this. So far, we've only got about 15, 20 years. But over the next few years, we should be able to get that up to 30 years, which would really improve the findings. But actually, already there's some indications that I think we could be hopeful here, because there are some studies that have used PET scanning and MRIs and even autopsies and identified that people who have higher levels of arts engagement actually have better preservation of cognition, even when these studies identify that they've got reduced blood flow to certain brain regions and even white matter lesions as well. So some of this underlying data suggests that there is a value to continuing this kind of research. There's also a role even when people develop dementia. I'm sure many people know a relative or somebody else in their lives who has unfortunately developed Alzheimer's disease and not been able to remember relatives, but can still sing the lyrics to White Christmas, even far into the disease. And there's really interesting neuroimaging data now to explain why this is. And there's actually a particular region of the brain, which is very small in red on the top left, which is the region involved in long-term musical memory. And this is a region that, even though it does accumulate amyloid beta deposits, which is one of the hallmarks of dementia, actually develops some of the other hallmarks like hypermetabolism and grey matter atrophy much later on. So this part of the brain is actually quite well preserved, even into the advanced stages of dementia. And that's one of the reasons that this preservation of musical memory can be preserved, even when other types of memory are less well preserved. And there's a reason as well why it's often the golden oldie tunes that people remember, which is that these are songs that get particularly charged emotionally, and so therefore have that dopamine tag that I mentioned. And dopamine is involved in memory response. There's also a particularly good reason why it's not just about singing those songs, but actually implications for broader cognition, which is that people who can remember songs, that memory essentially can kind of unlock a back door through to broader memories. So we actually find that people who listen to favorite songs when they've got Alzheimer's disease not only remember the songs, but can often then start talking more fluently about other events in their lives. And this is kind of a backdoor pathway through to the hippocampus that's been identified that music can sort of unlock. And some of the studies that have looked at this have tried playing familiar music in the background and actually found that people with Alzheimer's disease suddenly have better personal memories about facts in their lives, as well as better autobiographical memory recall, both from recent events and things from decades previously. And this is an effect that doesn't actually get seen in healthy controls. So this is a really nice way of thinking about how music can be used to support communication in people with Alzheimer's disease. Of course, there have been hopes that maybe this means that there could be broader cognitive benefits, perhaps better preservation of cognition through the arts in dementia. I'll be totally honest, at the moment, the evidence isn't really there to support that. And the meta-analyses that have looked at existing studies haven't found the kind of broad cognitive effects within dementia beyond those specific memories. Although there was actually a recent study in China that's had some promising results, so there is more work going on. And there are also broader quality of life aspects to consider. People who have dementia often become much more behaviorally agitated by things that are scaring them, like noises. Background music actually not only helps to buffer those, but also helps to reduce stress response, leading to improvements in behavioral agitation. And just like I mentioned for healthy populations with depression, we see meta-analytic effects for improvements in depressive symptoms in dementia as well. And these could have clinical relevance given that stress and depression actually are associated with faster accumulation of beta amyloid and tau and hippocampal atrophy as well. And this also makes us think about how we can perhaps reconceptualize dementia care. Hodjeweg is a village in the Netherlands that was opened 15 years ago, which is a dementia village purely for dementia patients, but putting all of this research to use, providing them with their own supermarkets and pubs, staff in plain clothes, all completely secure, but as a way of trying to support them living independently within this setting for longer. And their results actually show that this sort of hyper aesthetic arts-based environment is linked in with fewer behavioral agitation problems, lower need for incontinence materials, lower need for sedatives, and better preservation of day-to-day functioning. As well as thinking about cognition as well, I also want to touch on some of the broader neuroscience literature thinking about physical rehabilitation. This is one example, which is a program called Breathe Magic, which is for children who have hemiplegia, so one-sided paralysis caused by cerebral palsy or acquired brain injury. And this took all the ingredients of hand therapy, but turned it into magic tricks, working with the magic circle. So trying to add in those ingredients of joy and aesthetics and creativity and improving motivation and engagement and fun for the young people. They actually have fantastic results through a series of clinical trials, and I've been very privileged to work with them on some of this research. And they've shown that 92% of the young people who go through it have improvements in their bimanual two-handed ability. But alongside that, their neuroimaging studies demonstrate that there's actually improved lateralization of response, so the right hemisphere corresponding to the physical action they're doing. And around half the participants also have increased white matter integrity in parts of the brain like the corticospinal tract. So this is one example for upper limb rehabilitation of how the arts can support. And there are also fantastic examples of lower limb and broader physical rehabilitation. So for example, there are over 300 communities around the world now offering Dance for Parkinson's programs. We've been running a 5-year trial on this recently in partnership with King's College London. And these studies, including ours, are repeatedly showing that there is stabilization or sometimes some improvement in symptoms compared to control groups. Now, some of this is around the arts providing those physical activity ingredients, but again, with the motivational processes and the mental health support as well. But there are also other mechanisms like entrainment. So this is the concept that when we listen to music, we experience a sensory motor coupling. So the sensing parts of sensing the music and our rhythmic and motor response become coordinated. And we sort of create a temporal map prediction of where we expect beats to fall and synchronize our movements to this. And entrainment studies have shown that in broad populations like people who've had a stroke, simply listening to recorded music actually helps movements to improve. So people on average can walk an extra 11 meters per minute if they're listening to music compared to not, and also improvements in their balance and their broader aspects of their gait as well. So this is all providing additional information about how integrating the arts into these existing rehabilitation programs could help to improve outcomes. Thinking more about some of these clinical outcomes as well, but moving back into acute settings like hospitals. I spent several years working in the NHS, and we did a lot of research considering how those simple integration of the arts could improve the core clinical outcomes. So for example, in neonatal intensive care units, simply having recorded music in those environments for babies is linked in with a diverse range of outcomes, including lowered heart rate and blood pressure, improved oxygen saturation, reduced apnea episodes, and also increased feeding, which leads to better weight gain and potential hospital discharge sooner. I unfortunately witnessed this firsthand with my youngest daughter, who had a very rough start to life. And although it was my least rigorous scientific study to date, I can definitely vouch for seeing these stabilization effects from singing to a baby in an incubator. And we see this across other parts of the hospital as well. I worked a lot on the use of music in surgical settings when I was in the NHS. And we ran a number of trials that showed things as well, like reductions in blood pressure and anxiety. And this was not only good for patient experience, but we also know that those higher levels of anxiety pre-surgery are associated with poorer clinical outcomes post-surgery. And there's also a medication component here. People who had recorded music, because they were calmer, they were actually needing lower levels of benzodiazepines to keep them less anxious. They had lower sedative requirements and also lower pain medication. So opioid requirements are typically about 30% less if people have something as simple as recorded music. And that's not only beneficial from a cost perspective, but also when we're thinking about opioid addiction, that's actually a really important way of trying to keep the dosage as low as possible to try and reduce those effects. These sort of cardiovascular stress responses as well not only have acute, but also long-term implications. There's increasing literature now suggesting that engaging in the arts, even if it's very stimulating and temporarily arouses us, actually helps us to be more relaxed at other times, building our autonomic tone. So for people who are hypertensive, for example, just listening to recorded music every day is associated with quite marked decreases in blood pressure. And these reductions in blood pressure, of course, have clinical implications for their risk of developing other diseases. For example, if we think about other activities like dance as well, dance, of course, has that combination of physical and aesthetic within it. But a number of trials now have shown that people who can engage in dance-based interventions have reductions in triglycerides, in blood glucose levels, in cholesterol levels, and even in aortic stiffness. But what's particularly interesting about these studies is they've not just compared dance to no intervention, they've compared dance to exercise. So essentially seeing what those aesthetic ingredients add on top. And these meta-analyses have shown that the results are better for dance than exercise when we're considering those results. And epidemiological studies have taken this further. We've done some work in this space as well, as have teams in other countries, showing that people who are engaged more in dance-based activities have around a third lower risk of developing coronary heart disease and type 2 diabetes, as well as actually nearly half the risk of experiencing cardiovascular disease mortality. Again, if we compare this to physical activity like walking, these effect sizes are actually equivalent or even greater, but we just don't think about or talk about the arts in the same way we talk about those other health behaviors yet. This also got us thinking a lot with my research group about aspects of physical decline, which again, not only have that physical component, but have a psychological and social component to them as well. So for example, chronic pain, we looked at older adults who had no experience of chronic pain and tracked their incidence over the following 12 years, finding a 25% reduced odds once we considered confounders for developing chronic pain in that time. And again, this was equivalent in effect size to thinking about vigorous physical activity, but no doubt this was tapping into some of the mechanisms that I mentioned briefly earlier about the pain response. We actually know that music activates some of the same regions of the brain involved in analgesic response, so essentially activating our own internal analgesic system, and also supporting with things like depression, which are major risk factors for chronic pain. And we've shown similar effects for age-related disability, thinking that this is things like managing your own money, being able to prepare your own meals, get out and about on your own. So not just a physical component, but also a cognitive component. Again, we've been finding fairly equivalent results to exercise and reduced odds of incidence if people are engaged in the arts. So again, drawing this time on the cognitive literature in combination with the physical. We recently published a paper in Nature Communications where we also took an outcome-wide approach, identifying some other aspects of aging, like balance and like quality of sleep, which are better when people are engaged in the arts. And we've also looked at indices, so creating indices of frailty, for example, and looking at showing that the arts are associated with a reduced incidence and a slower rate of frailty development. So if you take an adult aged 80, they're 1.3 times more likely to be frail if they are not engaged in the arts compared to those who are engaged, even when taking account of confounders through various statistical methods. We've also recently started to look more at the underlying biology of this through epidemiological approaches, building on the kind of experimental biology work that we've been doing for the last decade. There are some really exciting studies coming out, experimental studies taking a transcriptomics approach, showing that music is related to gene expression. So one of these studies compared people relaxing to relaxing and listening to music, and showing that the listening to music group has upregulation of genes associated with things like dopamine synthesis and transportation, synaptic function, neurogenesis, so development of new neurons, and reduced neural apoptosis, so destruction of old neurons. And we've also now, through molecular epidemiology approaches, started looking at arts and epigenetic aging, so using epigenetic clocks and showing that there are associations between sort of slower rates of biological aging, pace of aging, for people who are engaged in the arts. What's interesting here is we've shown that these effects of the associations are present not just for frequency of engagement, but also for diversity of engagement. So essentially the number of ingredients that you're getting, as well as the frequency with which you're getting them. And again, these effect sizes are looking very similar to what we see for frequency and diversity of physical activities as well. There have also now been over a dozen studies that have looked at the association between arts and longevity. We published one of these in the BMJ. Now, obviously, there is a natural skepticism here about, is this still some kind of latent confounding underlying? And it is always possible with observational studies. We've taken account of this in as many ways as we can do with observational data. And we've actually shown that around half of the association is explained by the typical confound as we'd expect to see. But the remaining half, we haven't been able to explain away so far, and nor have the other studies that have been published. So it is possible that this is actually an accumulation of many of the factors I've already been talking about coming into play. And it's quite an exciting area to be continuing to pursue. But I just want to touch a little bit on behavior before I close, because as well as thinking about the arts in supporting our own personal health, we can also think about them as a tool for supporting health communication and affecting behaviors that way. One of my favorite interventions trying to do this is called Islos High, and it was a drama-based program that was developed to try and tackle very high teen pregnancy rates amongst Latina adolescents living in California. And they decided to develop an entire TV series with storylines, dance videos, music, basically looking at all the different approaches to managing contraception and childcare, and showing through the storylines the outcomes of the various different approaches. But what was really interesting is they took what's called a transmedia approach. So not only looking at the results, and not only looking at the storylines, but also building blogs, vlogs, resources online, like maps to where Planned Parenthood clinics were, videos showing how to use condoms properly. And the results from this have been really exciting. They had over 1 million views of these resources in the first series alone. This series has won loads of awards, including Primetime Emmy. They've even run experimental studies looking at some of the outcomes like condom usage, and actually showing that the people knowing how to use condoms effectively is significantly better through this transmedia approach than through more traditional public health messaging. So this is a nice way of thinking about how we can use the arts within public health campaigns. We know that people are much more likely to suspend disbelief. They're much more open and receptive to ideas when it's through stories. And we also can align ourselves with characters and sort of see how conversations play out, and even be primed to have the same conversations ourselves. And the UN and UNESCO are way ahead in this area as well. During the Ebola pandemic, they actually worked together with local communities to develop radio shows and stories and murals and songs about how to prevent the spread of Ebola. Their program is anticipated to have reached 10 million people in West Africa to combat disinformation, and it's anticipated that 1.5 million of those actually change their health behaviours towards Ebola as a result. I do just want to have a note of caution that this has to be done really carefully. 13 Reasons Why is a Netflix series that follows the storyline of an adolescent who takes her own life. And in the original series, there was a graphic 5-minute suicide scene, which completely goes against all the recommendations from charities like the Samaritans. Unfortunately, some of the data that came out afterwards suggested this led to increases in suicidal ideation, self-harm, and even suicide rates in the months that followed. This was not done in partnership with community organisations and charities, or with stakeholder groups like the other projects were. So I think we have to be very careful in this approach and make sure that it is done properly. But as a result, I think there is actually a real value to us thinking about the arts in clinical training, raising awareness about this literature amongst training medics and other healthcare professionals. There's also a value for their own health and well-being, which I've not touched on, but covers a lot of the same areas, particularly on mental health and burnout, and also a way of them supporting staff-patient communication. There are even studies that are actually looking at some of the harder aspects of training. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this study from Harvard that showed trainee radiologists these images and asked them to spot the lung nodule. They actually found that over 90% of the radiologists did spot the nodule, but only 17% spotted the gorilla. Top right-hand side. But this was a really important study in showing that sometimes medics are trained to spot what they're expecting to spot. And actually, there are some studies now that have used visual arts training with trainee medics and shown they can actually improve their visual literacy. So using arts as a way of supporting those sort of harder clinical skills that they need to develop. And that's just one out of many examples growing in this space. But I just want to close by mentioning our own behaviours, because actually all around the world, people's engagement in the arts is hugely unequal, both between countries and within countries. We find that it's typically the people who are more educated and wealthier who engage the most, and that pattern carries across every continent. We've been doing increasing research on this within my group, and we've actually identified that there are multiple different barriers to people's arts engagement, which don't just exist at individual levels, but across every aspect of our society, and are structurally embedded in the way that we fund the arts, the way we train artists, support the arts sector, support arts within education, and support our own engagement. And if we really want to change arts behaviours, then it's really important that we think quite holistically about those different barriers to engagement. In an ideal world, we would just have arts and everyone would engage with it freely. But unfortunately, at the moment, because that's not the case, I do think we have to think quite carefully about how to embed the arts, particularly for people with health conditions. So schemes like social prescribing are really exciting as a way of bringing the arts to populations who might be particularly in need, but might not already be engaging. Social prescribing has had all kinds of bad press, including people saying that it's can't reach the right people, that there are these inequalities and social disparities in access. This is really frustrating because actually the evidence that these kinds of papers are talking about have come from small scale evaluations or narrow approaches to thinking about only one type of data. And actually we've been looking at this from multiple different data perspectives and actually finding that's not the case. We looked at integrated care records from 19,000 people in Northwest London and showed that actually social prescribing was reaching those with greater multimorbidities, from more deprived backgrounds who typically made more use of healthcare. We then looked at data from 160,000 patients who've had social prescribing referrals, not just from GPs, but from all the other routes as well, like education, social care, community charities, and showed it was actually reaching those people from the most deprived areas the most. And we've recently integrated new questions on social prescribing into the ELSA cohort and shown that for older adults, it's the same story. So it's people with higher multimorbidities, experiencing chronic pain and diabetes, and greater socioeconomic adversity who are actually getting it the most. So I think there's real promise from schemes like this. And I think there's real value to social prescribing. For every pound invested, there's £3.42 that's thought to be earned back from that. People who engage more in the arts actually engage less with secondary and tertiary care and more with primary care. So actually shifting to more preventative care behaviours, which is exactly what we would like. And we've also been working with the Department for Culture, Media and Sport on a major new health economics piece, which is coming out in the next few weeks, so I couldn't share the results, but basically estimating from a public health perspective, what's the value of having arts in terms of people's use of the or avoidance of use of the healthcare system, their quality adjusted life years and the productivity for the UK as well. And so watch the space because the results are really promising and highlighting the importance of investing in the arts if we really want to affect some of these longer term health economic outcomes. So finishing back at the WHO report, like I said, I've only touched on a fraction of the literature that was actually in this report, but I hope you've seen that this is a really vibrant space and actually the quality of the evidence here is already strong, but it's growing every month at the moment. I work across other areas, not just arts and health, other areas of health and medicine. And I had questions over the years about why I'm wasting my time on a soft aspect of health when I could focus more on the harder aspects of health and have a stronger career because of it. But I think it's the exact opposite of that. Over the last 50 years, we've discovered a new health behavior roughly every decade. Things like diet, physical activity, sleep, tobacco. We're now well versed in talking about these things and recognizing the importance of these factors in broad health outcomes. And I think that it is just the same for the arts. I think we're at that similar tipping point where the evidence base is getting really strong and people are being able to articulate why the arts are important and what their impact is in all aspects of health. And there are some really exciting things underway at the moment, including with WHO, who've just launched a major international arts health lab to support new policy development in this space. They're currently planning a new technical report, briefing, and hopefully a technical resolution, which would be formally designating the arts as a health behaviour so that it's considered alongside those other behaviours that I mentioned. So I really believe in the next few years, we're likely to get to a tipping point where actually there is then the recognition that this is something that we really need to be taking seriously and really considering how we're funding and valuing this as a behaviour within people's lives. If you're interested in more, I published a book a number of years ago now that was looking at how to integrate arts programmes into clinical care to sort of tackle different health outcomes. We've also recently published a report on the 100 or so epidemiology papers that we've done in this space. And I've got a new book on this, not coming out for a little while, but just finished, that will talk more about this literature as well. I just want to finish by acknowledging my funders here and saying thank you so much for your attention.
That was all honestly one of the most impactful lectures I've ever heard, and hopefully will change practice, be a turning point for, there are many key people in the room tonight, Daisy, so hopefully it will be a turning point for Ireland, what you've had to share with us. Now, we have a panel discussion, please, and I'm going to introduce you to some of the panel members, and I'll ask them to come up as I call their names. I feel like a school teacher. Professor Mary Horgan. Mary is interim Chief Medical Officer at the Department of Health, appointed by the Minister Stephen Donnelly in June 2024. She's Professor of Infectious Diseases now at UCD, latterly of UCC, and I think she's best known to most of us in the room as the past president of the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland and the first female president of the college. So thank you, Mary, for joining us. I'd also like to invite to the panel Tanya Benotti. Tanya is director of the Whole of Government Creative Ireland programme. The objective of the programme is to embed creativity in public policy. One of the pillars of her work, and she covers Creative Ireland, so we're talking everything. But one of the pillars of her work is creativity, health and well-being in partnership with the Department of Culture, the Department of Health, the HSE and the Arts Council. I'd like to invite to the panel Dr. Siobhan Ivrian. Siobhan is the HSE's National Clinical Director of Integrated Care at the Office of the Chief Clinical Officer. She's responsible for leading on the national clinical programs managed through clinical design and innovation, in addition to numerous other programs of work that require clinical direction, design or response and engagement. So thank you, Siobhan, for joining us this evening. And finally, I'd like to invite to the panel Dr. Kevin McCarroll. Kevin is a consultant physician and geriatrician specialising in bone health and osteoporosis at St. James's Hospital here. And he is the director of the Creative Life Pillar in MISA at the hospital here. So thank you all for joining us in the panel. Now, I'd like to start by maybe addressing a question to each of you, if I may. Addressing a question, Daisy. Thank you. And maybe if I could start, maybe first of all, the panel will respond to Daisy's unbelievably informed talk. But also maybe if I could start with you, Mary, if that's okay. You play, as Chief Medical Officer, a critical role, of course, in developing policy and strategies to support and improve population health, and which aligns very beautifully with a lot of Daisy's content. And given the depth of your own experience in dealing with medicine and health, and indeed the leadership role you took during the COVID pandemic, what is your own perception of the impact of participation in creativity and cultural activity on well-being and the future for Ireland in that context?
Yeah, I suppose I've had a number of roles where I've seen the benefit of the arts in medicine. I, as president of the College of Physicians, for those of you who don't know, is the largest postgraduate training body in the country, and then I was dean of the School of Medicine in UCC, and what to me is really important as a healthcare professional is the involvement of people outside health in teaching us how to care for patients, particularly in the arts. And I was very much, I suppose, an advocate and implemented a number of programs where we had people, particularly from the arts across the university and indeed beyond that at postgraduate level, and got them involved. I think one of the issues we have as healthcare professionals, we see patients in very clinical setting and don't really see the world they live in outside medicine, whether that's in the hospital or in clinical practice. When they go back to their real world, those issues of isolation, social exclusion, because they feel things like the arts are out of their league, loneliness. And really what's important here is participation. And this happens with the arts. And I think it's as Daisy said, making it accessible and obviously affordable to everybody, and seeing the patient or the person with a chronic illness or loneliness that isn't often apparent in a more holistic view. So I've only been in the Department of Health for about 5 weeks, and I was talking earlier about the fantastic work that Matthew Doyle and his team do leading on Healthy Ireland. And I think the COVID pandemic brought a lot of bad things, but it actually stimulated a lot of good things. And the Renew with Creative Ireland, Department of Health, HSE, really probably were triggered by that loneliness and isolation during the pandemic, and has led to a number of really very successful areas where health and the arts, both for prevention, but also for treatment. And we saw that outlined in loads of the studies that Daisy. So I suppose for me, I suppose my role is really to advocate for things that work and try to shift the balance of all the funding going for acute or treatment of patients to prevention of things happening, because that's only currently a small amount of our budget.
It's a great segue to Tanya, if I may. Tanya, as I said, has a remarkably large portfolio, but I know of her own personal interest in the arts and health, and it's terrific that she is so supportive of that particular initiative. Will you tell us a little bit about Arts and Health and Creative Ireland, your engagement, the COVID-19 experience, and maybe I didn't like to ask Mary because she's only a wet week in the job, but how much is actually dedicated of the total health budget, for example, to creativity?
Oh, sadly, none. And I don't know about anybody else in the room, but I look across the room and I know how many people are very committed to this area. And I've had a fan crush on Daisy and to meet her in the flesh and to hear this. And the thing that just kept booming in my head is the evidence is there for the health service. And that's why it's hugely important to have the Department of Health and the HSE here, because I think many of the people in this room are hugely committed to arts and culture. I see people nodding all over the room in healthcare practice. We have done some smashing projects, as you know, Roseanne. We have funded social prescribing. We have done 1,800 concerts in nursing homes. Like, we're all in the culture sector. I think what I learned listening to Professor Fancourt is it's so wonderful to have senior health policymakers here, but how do we as a country, and looking at the lack of data there from Ireland, how do we as a country have a progressive arts and healthcare policy? And to have Mary there at the top thinking about public health, I thought it was just so compelling to see the evidence. The evidence is there. I don't think we need to make the case for it anymore, but we don't have a funding line on the health side. So We have done a lot of research, as some of you know. We've worked with Professor Kenny and Tilda. We've looked at longitudinal surveys, all the correlation that Daisy spoke about. Participating in cultural and creative activities correlates with that increased well-being. But really the question, I think, for Ireland, the wealthy society that we are now, is what does that mean for the Department of Health and for healthcare policy? Because I think we have wonderful individual projects, many of them led by the people in the room, but real policy change, real ownership by the Department of Health, which is why it's great to see Mary here, would be the single greatest transformative thing.
Was there something that triggered it in the UK? You are very much more ahead, both in social prescribing and in creativity and health. Maybe it doesn't feel like it, Daisy, but you are. Can we just, yeah.
I think the depressing thing is what really triggered it was just suddenly having one policymaker who decided that they thought this was worth it, and then being able to unlock all of those doors. But I know you'd like to think it was a more objective process than that to getting those kinds of seismic policy shifts.
When you say the policymaker, do you mean in government?
Yeah, we initially had someone within the House of Lords who decided to champion this and then pulled together an all-party parliamentary group, and that really kick-started a whole process that then sort of gathered momentum.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to turn now to Siobhan Ivrian. Siobhan, so I saw you writing furiously during Daisy's presentation. Maybe you could enlighten us a little bit about the potential within your own programs for introducing some of these creative interventions.
Thanks, Roseanne. And can I just start by thanking Daisy for what was just a mind-expanding talk. Having spent the morning dealing with things like activity-based funding, it was such a pleasure to come along to this this evening. Really fantastic. So one of our clinical programs for older persons is involved in developing an age-friendly health service. And they're very focused on arts and age-appropriate settings. And I saw Dominic in the audience here from Global Brain Health Ireland. Mm-hmm. I know our National Clinical Advisor in the area of older persons has linked in with GBHI. Another area is perinatal mental health. But just listening to Daisy's talk, one area that strikes me very forcibly, a clinical program that we have for disability, would be ripe, I think, for intervention from the creative arts point of view. So it's something I'm going to go back and think about and talk to Tanya about, and then Mary. I think there's a lot of scope here for introducing this across our clinical programs, but I am thinking of disability, particularly across the age ranges, because of the impact and that effect on cognitive decline. So they're just some thoughts. And I was very lucky to be involved in social prescribing in Tala a number of years ago when there was a dedicated person in to lead on social prescribing. And again, it was what you described there, Daisy, for people with psychiatric and psychological disorders and loneliness benefited hugely from those type of artistic and music interventions.
Okay, yeah. We're going to have an opportunity from the audience to ask questions in a moment. I just wanted Kevin McCarroll maybe to maybe let us know with respect to education in the arts and some of the innovative programs that yourself and Roisin Nevin have been involved in, including the National College of Art and Design up the road for students there.
Thanks, Daisy, for a fantastic talk, particularly looking at the biology of the impact of arts on health and real sort of hard evidence there for what we're doing. Yeah, I think education is a major thing because doctors have a very much a biomedical model when they approach health and don't really value the importance of arts. And I think as well for artists and those in the arts community as well, I think for them to navigate themselves in the healthcare system can be difficult as well. And that's where we need to bring artists and people in the arts community with healthcare together. In relation to that, this week actually is a sort of a launch of the immersion of students from the National College of Art and Design for the first ever professional diploma in arts and health, which Roisin Nevin, our Creative Life Coordinator, has co-designed this module, where the students will actually be immersed within the Creative Life Hub in MISA. And I think they will get great learnings from that. And they're actually, some of the students are actually here today, so they are. We've also tried to promote education as much as possible. For example, on the curriculum in Trinity College, there isn't actually any arts and health. And Roisin Nevin has organised from last year modules for the first year medical students. I think that's really important because we have to sort of target in the training for medical students so you actually appreciate the value of arts and health as well. In general as well, we tried, in the Creative Hub MISA here to actually have events to promote, arts and health and also connecting artists with healthcare professionals. We had international seminar in music and aging, and I know Rialta as well actually had events where we're sort of reaching, connecting networks as well last year as well, where artists were coming here together. So it's really important. I think the education piece is really important going ahead, because there still is a very significant deficit in people's understanding of the value of arts and health. And actually, some of the interventions are not expensive. They're not something which are, which is very financially very demanding. In the HSC, I think it's important that both at a hospital level and also a group hospital level and also a national level, that there is a focus on funding for the arts, because this is actually very challenging, even in creative life here itself,
Thank you. I'll open it to the floor in a moment, but we're in an acute hospital now, and we seem to be bouncing from crisis to crisis at the moment in terms of the health service, very much related to the rapid escalation in older age in Ireland and the demographic changes, etc. A lot of the work that you identified was done initially, your original work, as an acute clinician yourself. And it occurs to me, our ambition here in St. James's is to be Ireland's academic medical health sciences campus. We've a very good rationale for that ambition, and we're developing it. But surely this is one area that, having listened to you, we could start to navigate in a positive way in the context of embedding research in clinical activity, which might well impact on clinical outcomes, etc., and the pressure points like admission avoidance and length of stay, which we're all very vexed with for much of the week. Do you want to comment on that, Daisy?
Yeah, I just agree. I think there are some quick wins that are very low cost and very low risk as well. Things like recorded music in high anxiety areas like pre-surgery, where actually there's not a lot to lose by doing that, but the evidence is so strong in those areas for the benefits that can come out. And that's the kind of thing where being able to evaluate those benefits further is a good way of starting that positive cycle of seeing the benefits and reporting them, and then being able to move into some of the areas that might be a little bit more complicated or have more resistance from whoever's involved.
Okay, thank you. We're going to open this up to the audience, and who's my audience microphone holder? Archana, thank you very much. Will you take Kevin's microphone there, and then I can hand it to whoever of the panel would like to. And does anybody would have a question or a comment? Yes. Cathal McCrory is the co-PI of the Tilda study. Daisy.
Daisy, thank you for a wonderful presentation. It was really enjoyable. One of my questions is about selection effects in this literature, right? So I was looking at I don't know if that was an IPD meta-analysis or aggregate meta-analysis. Did you, well, presumably you did do this, did you look at the funnel plots for evidence of selection bias within those? And in the observational studies, yeah?
Yeah, we have done. Within the observational studies, we've personally only worked with the representative cohorts, and within that we have run some extra tests that have looked at some of the selection effects as well. I think that is much more of a case in some of the studies that are with more convenient samples, where there might as well be cross-sectional analyses going on as well, and that's one of the reasons we've avoided some of the large-scale volunteer databases like biobank type approaches to doing these analyses, because I think that does become a particular problem there. But so far, the results have been robust to those when we've tested them, but it's something we're always very conscious of. And also because we take a triangulation approach, as well as running the observational studies, we always do have ongoing the clinical trials and lab experiments as well that mean we can test causality on some of the key findings through those approaches too.
Oh, that's great. I was just wondering because some of the effect sizes looked very large to me, and I did wonder in the observational studies at least. For example, did you look at unpublished studies, unpublished literatures, look at conference abstracts that never actually were published? So that was kind of one. And then the second one, you did mention about controlling for confound. So socioeconomic status is probably the classic one, and it seems that was taken account of. And then there's other factors that potentially could be moderators of the outcome or potential confounders in their own right. And I'm thinking things like personality factors. So something like openness to experience, which is associated with enjoyment of novelty, the likelihood you'll engage in activities like going to theatres and plays and musical events and so on. Do you consider those things in these types of analyses?
Yeah, we do consider things like that. And also we use other approaches, so things like fixed effects analyses that would take account of time and variant factors, and instrumental variable approaches for unmeasured confounders, and also negative controls where we're looking at other outcomes that might have the same patterning, but we wouldn't expect to have the same exposure with the arts.
Okay, thanks, Carl. Yes, yes. Oh, hi. Yes, hello, how are you? Will you say for the purposes of those in the audience and online your name? And
my name is Helen O'Donoghue. I hope it's a linked question to Colin's. Of all the people that have participated in your studies, are any of them full-time professional artists?
You mean leading the studies or participating?
Participating.
Participating. Yes, some of the studies that we've done have actually used that population. I mean, as you might be aware, when we look at a public health level, we actually see that full-time professional artists tend to have better well-being than the general population, but actually tend to have higher levels of stress and anxiety and depression. And I think that is a major issue, and to do with the kind of precarity that's often associated with the arts sector. So I think I didn't talk about the literature on that, but I think that is a major thing that we need to consider. But we have had professional artists who've been patients who've taken part and still been having the benefits when they're put through interventions.
Oh, I'm really pleased to hear that. So I look at Tanya, because I think that is, you know, I come from an arts background, but I've always advocated for the arts in education, the arts in health, and the arts in public life. But sometimes it feels a little bit like the arts are hijacked, because yes, the benefits are, the evidence is there, but the care of artists and the care of the whole arts community is absolutely critical in this discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Helen. That's a great point. Yes. Roman, yeah, did you say your full name? Thanks, Roman.
Thank you very much. Roman Romero-Tuno. I work as a consultant geriatrician here in St. James Hospital. Congratulations, everyone, for a fantastic lecture. And one of the barriers that we've been discussing locally here is the fact that music therapy is not a recognised profession in Ireland. I don't know, Daisy, if you do realise of that. And do you think that's reasonable given the amount of evidence that you're presenting, and perhaps inviting the Chief Medical Officer to comment on that as well, please?
I think I probably prefer to hand straight over for comment on
Give her a
that.
chance.
Okay, since becoming the Chief Medical Officer, I've been asked a lot of questions, so this one I hadn't prepared for. So, you know, for those of us who are either involved personally or professionally in things like people with intellectual disability, children with additional needs, I mean, there's clear evidence that music therapy works in that setting. We had a conversation early on, especially about autism. And I don't see why it shouldn't be, and why it's not a recognized profession within the country. I think part of the issue, and change is always difficult, but going from very traditional siloed way of dealing with health, we need to move from that, because while it works for a lot of things, life has changed, and health and how we deliver it needs to change also. We tend to be too siloed, and I think a lot of the change that's coming with Sloan to Care is pushing things out into the community, but that shouldn't be just out to public health or out to general practitioners. It needs to encompass a whole lot of diverse ways of us preventing illness, which I think is what we should really be focusing on. One real way of doing that, I see Linda Doyle here, is putting more money in education. Probably one of the best ways of investing in health is like that, but like looking at different ways of providing healthcare. But sometimes the challenge is not with policymakers, it's with people who are practicing in healthcare not wanting to change. And sometimes you have to nudge people along, and then it happens, and it's like this, that all the time. So I do think we need to be more ambitious and visionary and a bit risk-taking in a very, and I mean that in the best of ways, in delivering healthcare differently than we do, as we've done for the last probably 30 years, of kind of very similar ways until more recently when we see change.
Can I just pick up on one of those, on something?
Please
there,
do, Tanya. Yeah.
So picking up on Helen, I mean, none of these projects are possible without artists and creative practitioners. So that's stating the blindingly obvious. It's wonderful to see the Arts Council here, because I think one of the things we're thinking about is how do we support these artists and creative professionals, whether recognised or not by the Department of Health, how do we support them to work in those environments? And I think that's something that the Arts Council is really thinking about in its arts and health policy, how to do more of that. And obviously we've got the Provost of Trinity here, and I think it's really progressive to think that future medical students and students in NCAD, that we're trying to do that collaborative piece, and having medical students, nursing students and design students working in hospitals and having that part of their third level education.
Just to say that the medical students actually run an annual competition. Jim Meany established this and continues to coordinate it, where they have a competition amongst medical students in Trinity for something creative every year. And it's a public exhibition in our National Art Exhibition Centre in the centre of the city. It's incredibly productive, and the standard of what is produced is remarkable, very, very diverse. And what strikes me about it year on year is the empathy of the medical students and how they're translating that empathy. Some of them, their first exposure to a patient, maybe with dementia or who's dying, etc., how they translate that into creativity. And we really need to continue to nurture that. That strikes me as well, because it's often lost in their latter years in medical school with the biomedical training, except that in James's here, we have the Bleeping Interns Choir. And that was established by Anne-Marie O'Dwyer, who's in the audience, who will kill me, of course, for mentioning this. She did her master's on the impact of having a choir for our first year doctors, and on the anxiety and stress that they experience during that first year. And it's just an hour a week where the senior consultant staff and senior registrar staff take the interns' bleeps for that 1 hour, and they have a choir and sing together. And the hospital provides lunch. I'm sure that's not at all a motivation for joining the choir. And then they perform at our grand rounds and at other occasions on behalf of those of us working in the hospital. That's been a huge success. And yeah, the Bleeping Interns is a great initiative. Right, somebody else have their hand up. Oh, sorry, Provost.
I feel you don't need to let me in just because that Linda Doyle is my name. I just wanted to make one comment to follow up on Tanya and one question. So, I think there is a kind of deeply systematic problem in that artists are just simply not paid enough. And essentially, if you want to change a system and you have a group of people who earn a lot and a group of people who earn a little, the things that the people who earn a little do will always be less respected. And I mean, that to me is, I'm not saying that everyone needs to earn the same amount, but in all of the areas I've worked in, like I worked in engineering and the arts, you had this, I suppose, disproportionate leaning in one direction always. And that kind of feeds into the discipline where the engineering is ultimately taken more seriously than the arts when you're actually looking at something like this. So I think it's not just about the Arts Council supporting, it's people paying for the services of the artists, I think really seriously is part of this.
To be clear, every single artist is paid in every Creative Ireland project. But, if there isn't an authoritative statement from the Department of Health that this is something that they value within healthcare, that has to be the departure point from my point of view strategically, because you're right, the consultants will always be paid more than the artists.
I don't mean they should be paid, or I should be paid like a consultant. I mean, I do think it's an issue. But the question I had was, what is the perception of the user of the service? And let me put that in context. So, for example, in Trinity, we have a counselling service, and oftentimes our students don't consider themselves in the service if they're in a group or they're doing something else, despite all the evidence we have that will show that that treatment of being in a group is much better for them with the particular issues that they have. They only see themselves as being taken seriously for a one-on-one consultation that they in their heads see as the right thing you're getting versus the thing you're fobbing me off on. So have you done any work on kind of the perceptions of users of, we'll say, social prescribing and what they consider, and do they consider themselves as getting kind of, I suppose, their issues really addressed, if you know what I mean?
That was something I was really nervous about when I worked with government on the development of the NHS's social prescribing scheme. And I was really worried people would basically be saying, like, why am I being referred to this when I wanted a drug, and feel they weren't being taken seriously. I always think as well, like, what would the Sun newspaper write as the headline? And I was worried that they'd be sort of saying, like, waste of funds on things like choirs. It was actually the opposite. I think actually because of the whole mechanism of social prescribing, instead of having a 10-minute GP appointment, you actually get up to an hour with a link worker who actually is then helping you to find the activities, talking about what your problems are, what matters to you. Patients are often feeling heard. And in fact, some of our studies are suggesting that the repeated sessions patients have with link workers function a little bit like a counselling service, but with the additional behavioural activation of referring to community activities. So actually that being heard has gone down so much better than we anticipated. And it's been the opposite, people actually feeling that this is a better tailored service than the fob off they might have had with the short appointment or the overly simplistic solution. This also can occur alongside other treatments as well. And I've actually been quite pleasantly surprised by their media approach showing the receptiveness of this. Some of the headlines have been wrong about the access issues, but the benefit issues, there have been some really good media stories showing that people are quite accepting about the concept of this idea.
Can I just make a comment as well, just about, music therapy? And, we have experience here in MISA. We have over 200 patients that received music therapy for a wide variety of conditions, particularly stroke. And I have to say, really, there's been very significant benefits, from the patients, the carers, their family members. And it is an ongoing challenge getting funding for that. But certainly, and there's a lot of emerging evidence now for music therapy, I know, in children with autism, but certainly in patients with stroke. And also their journey in the hospital, because many patients are on the ward, is very lonely for their mental health, their psychological well-being as well. And we've got an awful lot of positive feedback from them. We also, I suppose, from our artists in residence as well, and arts on prescription, we have used social prescribing for people to access that as well, have got very positive feedback for the patients with the dance artists with the Parkinson patients, and also for the creative workshops for the artists in residence here. So, and these are, again, patients with a variety of clinical conditions, including dementia and other diagnoses.
So I'm hearing cries for recognition and funding. That's, yeah, no, this is important. Bernard, yes, Bernard Walsh. Do you want to say who you are, Bernard?
Yeah, Bernard Walsh, geriatrician in James's. I'm so glad that you started off tonight, Roseanne, bringing Davis, who was so close to us all, to the fore in his concept of the creative life. And it's wonderful to have Mary here tonight. And because Mary shared very much Davis's vision of the creative arts and co-wrote so many books with him. And I think Davis would be absolutely delighted to see this tonight, because this meeting, this lecture tonight, and is the coming of age in many ways of the concept of the creative life that we have here. And I suppose we all have seen the patients, you think back, with advanced dementia, but they're still brilliant pianists. They still are a wonderful singer, and some of the greatest works of art, as we've all seen, are done by people with quite advanced dementia. And when you see the role of creative life in the older patient, and you see it when I saw the music there in the neonatal unit, I mean, it showed you the whole spectrum of life, from the neonatal to the advanced patients with dementia. This is what the creative life is doing and can do and will do. And I know Mary Hawken is listening tonight.
Thanks, Bernard. Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much for that, Bernard. David Robinson. Oh, sorry. One of the students first en route. Is that right? Yes. Yeah, just there. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, good evening. First of all,
you just say who you are, Hans. I know who you are.
I'm Hans Geisler. My wife is called Deirdre. I'm a carer for my wife. Just to let you know, I also suffer from MS, and things are difficult. But what this course that we were on, the creative life, arts and sculpture, was so good that it brought the people that around the table with dementia out and could talk to each other. Some of them, one person, an individual, had a form of Alzheimer's that affected her speech. But she actually enjoyed the course. came up afterwards and hugged me and said, thank you. Because what do? You're mixing with people with the same thing. And then also, as carers, you're getting to find out what goes on, which is very important. And I can't express my thanks as so much to everything that is done here in James's, and we'll say the HSC and the health service on both counts, MS and dementia. And I really would look forward to another course. Let's try and keep them out of hospital. And that is a very important thing, because it will be money well spent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hans. Now, it's 6:30, and I promised that we would close at 6:30. It's been such a vibrant discussion. We'll have to do this again, but I hope that we will leave this room, those of us who can, with the ambition of making our university and our hospital leaders in creativity and health for our students, our patients, and our staff in Ireland. So thank you, and thank you, Daisy. There are refreshments downstairs for everybody.